4 men, 4 fortunes so vast they'd be worth hundreds of billions today. And behind every one of them, a body count, a betrayal, or a lie the history books eventually caught up with. Let's go back in time and see what happened. Homestead, Pennsylvania, July 1892. The richest steelmaker in America is thousands of miles away in Scotland, and he's about to let another man do something unforgivable in his name. By 1892, Andrew Carnegie had built the largest steel operation in the United States and cultivated a public image few industrialists of his era could match. A self-made Scottish immigrant who preached that the rich had a moral duty to give their fortunes away and who publicly supported workers' right to unionize. His own rise made that self-made image genuinely earned, at least on paper. Born in 1835 to a Dunfermline handloom weaver put permanently out of work by the very industrialization Carnegie would later master, the family emigrated to Pittsburgh in poverty, and Carnegie started working at 13 as a bobbin boy in a cotton mill, then a telegraph messenger, before talent and aggressive ambition carried him through the Pennsylvania Railroad and into iron, bridges, and eventually steel. Just 3 years before Homestead, in 1889, he'd published his famous essay, The Gospel of Wealth, declaring flatly that the man who dies rich dies disgraced. That same year, his own company would prove exactly how much that public image was worth. Carnegie himself wasn't at the plant that summer. He'd already delegated full authority to his operations chairman, Henry Clay Frick, and left for his castle in Scotland before negotiations even began. On Carnegie's authority, Frick proposed a steep wage cut at the Homestead plant, despite those record profits, locked out the workforce when they refused, and brought in armed guards to secure the plant by force. The resulting confrontation on July 6th turned into a 13-hour gun battle that left at least 12 people dead before state troops finally restored order. Surviving correspondence between the two men makes clear Carnegie knew exactly what confrontation he was authorizing before he ever boarded his ship. When reporters finally reached Carnegie in Scotland, his public response was a masterpiece of calculated distance. He called the violence deplorable, then added that he had given up all active control of the business, a claim the same surviving correspondence directly contradicts. It's worth sitting with the gap between the two men Carnegie was constantly presenting to the world. To his workers and the American press, a hands-off philosopher king above the ugliness of labor disputes. To Frick, in private letters, an engaged partner who'd explicitly authorized breaking the union by whatever means necessary before he ever left the country. An anarchist's assassination attempt on Frick weeks later, unrelated to the union, barely registered against the damage already done to Carnegie's own name. He went on to fund over 2,500 libraries across the English-speaking world and gave away an estimated $350 million in his lifetime, worth roughly $10 billion or more in today's money, roughly 90% of his fortune. In a philanthropic campaign historians generally agree was genuine, not simply reputation management. Critics on both sides of the Atlantic never let him fully outrun Homestead anyway, branding him a hypocrite for preaching that dying rich meant dying disgraced, while hiding in Scotland from the consequences of his own company's decisions. A philanthropist's name, permanently attached to a strikebreakers massacre. Homestead haunted Carnegie for the rest of his life in a very specific way. He and Frick never spoke again after it, their partnership curdling into permanent bitter enmity fought out through lawsuits and rival art collections for the next 2.5 decades. In 1919, dying at 83, Carnegie finally reached out, sending word asking Frick for one last meeting to make peace before the end. Frick's reply came back immediately. "Tell him I'll see him in hell, where we are both going." Carnegie died weeks later, apparently still needing an absolution Frick had no intention of giving him. 23 years before Homestead, a different robber baron pulled off a scheme so audacious it nearly took down the entire American economy and got a sitting president's own family dragged into the scandal. Jay Gould, president of the Erie Railroad, earned a reputation so thoroughly poisonous that contemporary newspapers nicknamed him the Mephistopheles of Wall Street, the devil of American finance. His notoriety actually began the year before Black Friday. In 1868, when Cornelius Vanderbilt, the same Commodore we'll return to later tonight, tried to buy up enough Erie stock to seize control of the railroad, Gould and his partners fought back by secretly printing tens of thousands of new, essentially fraudulent shares, diluting Vanderbilt's holdings until his $2 million investment, worth roughly $45 million today, was nearly worthless. When a judge issued warrants for their arrest, Gould and his allies fled across the Hudson River to New Jersey with an estimated $6 million in cash, worth well over $130 million today, stuffed into suitcases, then bribed the New York State Senate to retroactively legalize the entire scheme. Vanderbilt, the single most powerful businessman in America, had just been outmaneuvered by a man half his physical size. He offered a $25,000 reward, worth roughly $500,000 today, for Gould's kidnapping. By 1869, alongside his business partner James Fisk, Gould set his sights on cornering the entire United States gold market. The plan depended on inside information about federal gold policy, so Gould cultivated a friendship with Abel Corbin, a small-time speculator who happened to be married to President Ulysses S. Grant's own sister. Through Corbin, Gould worked to influence a presidential appointment at the New York Sub-Treasury and used the resulting access to try to predict and manipulate exactly when the government might sell gold onto the open market. Throughout September 1869, Gould and Fisk aggressively bought up gold, driving the price from around $130 an ounce to over $160, dragging ordinary investors and speculators into a rising market that seemed unstoppable. On September 24th, the day that became known as Black Friday, President Grant finally realized what was happening and ordered the Treasury to sell $4 million in government gold, worth roughly $90 million today, onto the market. The price of gold collapsed almost instantly, wiping out fortunes across Wall Street in a matter of hours and bankrupting several major brokerage houses. Gould, tipped off just early enough, managed to sell his own position before the worst of the crash and walked away with his fortune largely intact. Fisk and Gould both escaped prosecution entirely. It wasn't Gould's only brush with real tragedy connected to money. Years earlier, an elderly investor he'd persuaded to sink $60,000, worth roughly $1.5 million today, into a struggling tannery business after a bitter falling out over the investment, took his own life, a death contemporaries directly connected to Gould's business dealings. Away from Wall Street, Gould himself was, by most accounts, an almost startling contradiction of his own reputation, a quiet, physically frail man who spent his evenings with his family, his orchid greenhouse, and his personal library, rather than the carousing his partner Fisk was famous for. He reportedly acknowledged the gap between the two versions of himself directly, once remarking that his domestic habits weren't calculated to make me particularly popular in Wall Street. Gould died a wealthy man in 1892, having spent decades as arguably the single most hated financier in American history. His daughter, Anna Gould, would go on to become one of the Gilded Age's most famous dollar princesses, inheriting a fortune of roughly $15 million, worth about $391 million today. And, we told you in a previous episode, watching a French count spend $10 million of it, nearly $260 million in today's money, in less than a decade. If Gould made his fortune through a single audacious gamble, our third robber baron built his through decades of the most systematic, patient ruthlessness American business had ever seen. John Davison Rockefeller was born to a father nicknamed Devil Bill, a traveling con man who sold fake cancer cures from town to town, and who was, at one point, wanted for a sexual assault charge under a false identity. Whatever John Rockefeller inherited from his father, it wasn't scruples about the truth, though he inherited plenty from his devoutly Baptist mother, growing into a man who never drank, kept a rigidly disciplined daily schedule for essentially his entire life, and gave generously to his church, even as a young clerk, earning almost nothing. What he built with that discipline, starting Standard Oil in 1870, was the most dominant monopoly the country had ever seen. One of Rockefeller's earliest and most notorious maneuvers came in November 1871, when he joined a secretive alliance of major railroads and refiners called the South Improvement Company, designed to secure crushing rate advantages over every competitor who wasn't part of it. Sitting in that same planning meeting was William Henry Vanderbilt, the very man whose infamous public be damned quote, "You're about to hear the real story behind." When word of the scheme leaked, furious independent oil producers in Pennsylvania organized a boycott so effective that the South Improvement Company's charter was suspended within months before it ever fully operated. Rockefeller absorbed the lesson instead of abandoning the goal. Rather than one scheme other refiners could see coming, he began quietly buying them out one by one in what became known as the Cleveland Massacre, offering each owner cash, Standard Oil stock, or, implicitly, ruin, and acquired 22 of Cleveland's 26 competing refineries within about 6 weeks. Rockefeller's tactics were methodical and, by most contemporary accounts, brutal. Standard Oil negotiated secret rebate deals with railroads that let it ship oil more cheaply than any competitor. Deals sometimes structured so that Standard even profited from its rivals' shipments. When rival companies tried building competing pipelines, Standard bought up the land along their planned routes to block construction outright. Company agents were widely reported to bribe state legislators, plant favorable stories in newspapers, and quietly buy out competitors that were, in reality, already secretly owned by Standard Oil itself. The strategy worked with terrifying efficiency. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled roughly 90% of American oil refining. Investigative journalist Ida Tarbell, whose own father had been ruined by Standard's tactics, spent years documenting the company's methods in a landmark exposé published in 1904, reporting that there was nothing which concerned the oil business which John Rockefeller was not on the inside of. In 1911, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled Standard Oil an illegal monopoly under the Sherman Antitrust Act and ordered it broken into 34 separate companies. It was meant to be a punishment. Instead, because Rockefeller retained stock in every resulting company, the breakup made him considerably richer. Historians widely consider him, by some calculations, the wealthiest individual in modern history, adjusted for the scale of the American economy at the time. Several of the resulting companies, including what eventually became ExxonMobil and Chevron, remain among the largest corporations on Earth. Rockefeller himself lived to be nearly 98, dying peacefully in his sleep in 1937, having kept his rigid daily routines and church habits essentially unchanged for decades. His funeral, by choice, was small and quiet, a strikingly modest final scene for a man whose fortune and whose tactics had reshaped an entire industry. Our final robber baron is remembered for 4 words he almost certainly never actually said, which somehow makes the truth about his family even more revealing. Cornelius Vanderbilt, nicknamed the Commodore, started working at just 11 years old, ferrying cargo and passengers around New York Harbor for his father's small boat business, and built the foundation of the family fortune first in shipping, then in railroads, becoming widely considered the original American robber baron, a man so competitively ruthless that court records show him engaged in fistfights well into his 50s. We already told you how Jay Gould outmaneuvered him for control of the Erie Railroad in 1868, printing worthless stock until Vanderbilt's investment evaporated. Losing simply wasn't something Vanderbilt tolerated quietly. When business partners once tried to cheat him in an entirely separate dispute, his reported response left no room for ambiguity. "Gentlemen, you have undertaken to cheat me. I won't sue you, for law is too slow. I'll ruin you." Here's where popular memory gets the family history wrong. The infamous line, "The public be damned," routinely attributed to Cornelius Vanderbilt himself, was actually spoken by his son, William Henry Vanderbilt, in an 1882 newspaper interview, 5 years after the Commodore had already died. Asked by a reporter whether the family's railroads were run for the public's benefit, William reportedly snapped back that the public could, quite literally, be damned, that the railroad existed to profit its owners and stockholders, full stop. The quote outlived every correction. It became, fairly or not, the single phrase that best summarized how ordinary Americans understood the entire robber baron era, a family fortune, and an entire generation of industrialists that saw no particular obligation to the public whose lives their railroads, oil fields, and steel mills quietly ran through. Vanderbilt was never widely known for philanthropy the way Carnegie or Rockefeller later would be. But shortly before his death, he made one notable exception, donating $1 million, worth roughly $26 million today, to found a university in Nashville, Tennessee, the school that still bears his name today. It stood as a strikingly isolated act of generosity from a man whose reputation, in almost every other respect, had been built on refusing to give an inch to anyone. Cornelius Vanderbilt died in January 1877 at 82, leaving a fortune of roughly $100 million, worth an estimated $2.7 billion today by simple inflation, though historians studying it as a share of the entire American economy at the time consider that figure a significant understatement of his real relative wealth. At the time, more money than the United States Treasury itself held in reserve. That fortune eventually reached his great-granddaughter, Consuelo Vanderbilt, whose forced marriage into British aristocracy we told you about in a previous episode. The money that built an empire 3 generations later was still being used to buy the same thing it always had: standing, respectability, and a title the family name alone couldn't purchase. 4 men who served on the same boards, fought the same battles, and sat in the same rooms, quietly reshaping an entire country's economy while the public argued over which one to hate most. Every fortune here had a body, a betrayal, or a lie buried underneath it. Tell me which one shocked you most, and if you want the deep dive in any of them. Until next time.